She had learned, in 7 years of working for a man who terrified half the eastern seaboard, that invisibility was its own kind of armor. You kept your head down. You kept your numbers precise. You kept your feelings folded so small they fit inside your chest like a letter no one had ever asked to read. Marguerite Bellows had perfected this. She had perfected it the way you perfect anything that keeps you alive, through repetition, through vigilance, through a quiet and unbroken discipline that left no room for error and even less room for hope. She was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and full-figured, with deep brown skin and eyes that cataloged everything in a room before most people had finished scanning for the exits. She wore sensible shoes and pressed slacks and spoke only when she had something worth saying. In the world of Dominic Calloway, a world of Italian wool and imported whiskey and decisions that ended careers or ended lives, Marguerite Bellows was the furniture. She was the lamp in the corner of a beautiful room that everyone used and no one noticed. She had decided, somewhere around year 3, that this was fine. That fine was enough. She was wrong. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already unusual because unusual things happened on Tuesdays in Callaway Industries the way storms happened in deserts. Technically possible, broadly unexpected, and impossible to ignore once they were upon you. It came in the Morning Post, nestled between a dry-cleaning invoice and a prospectus from the Harrington Group that Dominic would never read, but Marguerite would summarize into 4 bullet points by noon. The envelope was cream-colored, heavyweight stock, the kind of paper that cost more per sheet than Marguerite spent on lunch. Her name was written across the front in a looping, unhurried script, not typed, not addressed to her title or her department, but to her, Marguerite, as though whoever sent it had sat down and thought carefully about each letter before committing it to ink. She stood at the post-room table and held it for a long moment, long enough for Darren, the mailroom associate, to raise his eyebrows and say nothing, because even Darren understood that this was not his moment. She did not open it in the office. She opened it in the small break room on the 14th floor during the 12 minutes between Dominic's 9:30 briefing and his 10 o'clock call with the Port Authority liaison. She sat with a paper cup of tea she had not tasted and read the letter twice, and then a third time, and the third time her hands were not entirely steady. It was from a man named Sebastian Okafor. She had met him once, 3 weeks ago, at the industry reception hosted by the Meridian Foundation. He was a structural engineer by training who had somehow wandered into the orbit of urban development finance, which meant he appeared at the kind of functions Marguerite attended to take notes, and he appeared at them to make conversation. He had made conversation with her, not with Dominic, not with Dominic's glamorous senior counsel, Veronique Marsh, who had arrived at the reception in a column of red silk and immediately aggregated every pair of eyes in the room, with Marguerite. He had found her beside the cold buffet, annotating her program with a fine-tip pen, and he had asked what she was writing, and she had told him, and they had spoken for 40 minutes about infrastructure debt and about a novel they had both read and about her mother's garden in Baltimore. And when his car arrived, he had said that he hoped she would allow him to continue the conversation sometime. She had assumed that was the kind of thing people said at receptions the way they promised to call. She had been wrong about that too. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten front and back. It told her that he had thought about their conversation every day since, and that this was not nothing, that he understood. She moved in a complicated professional world, and he made no assumptions, but that he would very much like to take her to dinner, at a place of her choosing on a date convenient to her, and that if she found herself disinclined, he would respect that completely and think of her warmly and without resentment. It was, in short, the most courteous, most carefully considered piece of correspondence she had received in her adult life. She put it back in the cream envelope and tucked it into her tote bag and walked back to her desk and did not think about it for the rest of the morning. She thought about nothing else. Dominic Calloway was not a man you would describe with any single word because single words were inadequate to the architecture of him. He was 40 years old, 6'2", with the kind of face that sculptors used as evidence that bone structure was a form of violence. His family had built their empire across 3 generations in the gray and lucrative space between legitimate real estate development and the kind of logistical arrangements that certain men required and that no public ledger ever fully documented. He had inherited the organization at 28 when his father's heart had simply given out under the weight of decades, and he had spent the 12 years since refining it into something so controlled, so structurally elegant, that the few law enforcement investigators who suspected its true nature could never find the seams. He was, in the vocabulary of his world, untouchable. He was also, in the vocabulary of the only world Marguerite cared about, her employer. Nothing more. She had made certain of that. He did not notice her the way you notice a person. He noticed her the way you notice a load-bearing wall, with a kind of abstract confidence that it would hold, that it had always held, that it required no attention. She organized his schedule, translated his directives into actionable tasks, managed the 3 layers of administrative infrastructure beneath him, maintained the coded financial ledgers that only she and the organization's accountant fully understood, and ensured that every meeting, every call, every logistical arrangement ran with a precision that he accepted as atmospheric, like good weather or reliable gravity. In 7 years, she had never been late. She had never lost a file. She had never, not once, allowed her personal life, such as it was, to introduce a single degree of friction into the machinery of his days. Veronique Marsh noticed the letter. Of course she did, because Veronique noticed anything that might be relevant, and her definition of relevance was broader than most people's. She had been Dominic's senior counsel for 4 years and occupied a very specific position in the organizational ecosystem. Brilliant, visually arresting, and precisely calibrated to the image that Dominic presented to the legitimate world. She had seen Marguerite tuck the cream envelope into her bag with the focused care of someone concealing something precious, and she had filed that observation without comment, which was, Marguerite would later understand, a very bad sign. The day proceeded. Dominic's 10 o'clock ran long because the Port Authority liaison was evasive about the timeline on Pier 14, which meant Marguerite had to reschedule the 11 o'clock, which meant the cascade of adjustments she executed in 23 minutes without anyone observing the scale of the problem. She brought Dominic a briefing memo at noon, 3 pages, the Harrington prospectus reduced to its essential argument and its 3 critical weaknesses, and he accepted it without looking up from his desk. She left. He reached for his coffee. The coffee was at exactly the temperature he preferred because she had timed the walk from the kitchen accordingly. He did not notice this either. She wrote to Sebastian Okafor that evening from her apartment in the Crane Building, 6 blocks from the office, where she lived in the measured peace of a woman who had learned to make interior space very large, because exterior space offered her so little. She sat at the small desk by the window with the city lights assembling themselves in the dark below and wrote that she had been glad to receive his letter, that she did not often receive letters, that dinner on the 14th of the following month would suit her very well if he remained of the same mind, and that she was partial to Ethiopian food, if that was not too specific a preference to volunteer. She sealed it in a plain white envelope, addressed it carefully, and set it on the corner of the desk, where she would not stop thinking about it. She did not stop thinking about it. What she could not know, because there are things that happen in offices that pass below the threshold of the visible, even for a woman who noticed everything, was that Veronique Marsh had mentioned the letter to Dominic. not as information with agenda attached, or so the telling appeared. She had said it in passing, in the way of someone sharing something amusing, that Marguerite had received what appeared to be a personal letter and had hidden it rather endearingly, and wasn't it sweet that she had an admirer, and didn't Dominic think she deserved some happiness? The word sweet lodged in Dominic Calloway's chest like a splinter, and he did not examine it, and it did not leave. The second letter from Sebastian arrived 11 days later, and this time Dominic saw it. Not because he was watching for it, or so he would have told himself with some credibility, but because he was crossing the reception area when the post arrived, and he watched Marguerite go through the stack with her efficient, unsentimental hands, and he saw those hands pause. He saw her shoulders change. It was the most minute alteration, a millimeter of loosening, a breath drawn fractionally deeper. But Dominic Calloway had built his life on reading rooms and bodies, and he read hers in an instant, and something went wrong in him that he did not have a category for. She looked at the envelope with an expression he had never once directed at him across 7 years of proximity, an expression that was private and warm and quietly astonished, and he walked into his office and closed the door with a precision that was the closest he ever came to slamming it. He called Luca Ferreira into his office 20 minutes later. Luca was 44, compact and economical in both movement and speech, and had functioned as Dominic's operational lieutenant for 9 years. He was the kind of man who could solve a problem before it finished being stated, and who asked questions only to confirm detail, never to understand the rationale, because he trusted Dominic's rationale the way a compass trusts north. "I want to know who is writing to her," Dominic said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Luca nodded once and left. Marguerite, in her office, on the other side of the frosted glass partition, was constructing the quarterly coordination report with one half of her mind and reading Sebastian's second letter in her memory with the other. He had written about the structural poetry of suspension bridges. He had written about his aunt's funeral 3 years ago and how grief was a landscape you walked rather than a room you left. He had confirmed Thursday the 14th. He had signed it with his full name, and then below, with just the S, as though the formality had briefly exceeded what he actually felt and he had wanted to correct for it. She found this charming in a way that cost her something, because she had grown unaccustomed to being charmed. By the time Luca delivered a preliminary profile of Sebastian Okafor to Dominic's desk the following morning, 43 years old, principal at Okafor Urban Advisors, 2 published papers on post-industrial waterfront development, no criminal record, no associations of any concern. A man of entirely civilian respectability. Something had taken root in Dominic Calloway that he was still not naming correctly. He read the profile twice. He set it face down on his desk. He stood at his window for a long time and looked at the city. His city, the one he held with both hands and both fists, and tried to locate the source of the sound in him that was filling all the space where his control used to sit without effort. He asked Marguerite to come into his office at 3 o'clock for the weekly operations review, which was normal, except that for the first time in longer than he could account for, he watched her when she was not looking. She sat across the desk with her portfolio open and walked him through the ledger summaries with the unhurried competence of someone who had done this so many times that it had become a kind of music, each figure transitioning to the next with the rhythm of someone who understood not only the numbers but the story they were telling. She had flagged an irregularity in the Eastern Holdings account. She had traced it back 6 weeks without being asked. She had already identified the probable source, a clerical mismatch in the transfer sequence, and had drafted the correction. She laid it in front of him. He realized, sitting across from her in the gray afternoon light, that he did not know the last time he had looked at her face, not glanced at it, not processed it as part of the operational landscape, looked at it the way you look at something you are trying to understand. She was speaking, calmly and precisely, about the Eastern Holdings discrepancy, and he was listening to her voice as if hearing its particular quality for the first time, the low, deliberate timbre of it, the way she selected words with the economy of someone who considered language a resource not to be wasted, and he felt, with an unsettling clarity, that he was a man who had been walking past an extraordinary thing every single day for 7 years and calling it wallpaper. What Dominic did not know, because Marguerite had kept it from him with the same disciplined care with which she kept everything personal from him, was that the Eastern Holdings irregularity was not entirely innocent. She had suspected it for 3 weeks. She had traced it not to a clerical mismatch, but to a pattern, a specific, recurring pattern in the transfer architecture that suggested someone with internal access was routing small sums, never large enough to trigger automated review, into a holding structure outside the organization's visibility. Someone with enough familiarity with the ledger protocols to know exactly where the blind spots were. She had confirmed this 4 days ago. She had said nothing, because she was still building the chain of evidence, and because the shape of it was pointing somewhere she needed to be very certain about before she opened her mouth. Thursday the 14th arrived, and Marguerite left the office at 6 o'clock, which was 40 minutes earlier than her usual departure, and she wore a dress that she had purchased the previous Saturday. Deep green, structured at the shoulder, cut to move with her body rather than contain it. She wore earrings that had been her grandmother's, heavy amber teardrops that caught the light like something preserved and precious. She was, in the quiet privacy of her own considered assessment, beautiful. She had always been beautiful in ways that required a certain quality of attention to perceive, and she had stopped expecting that quality from her professional world a long time ago. But she was beautiful nonetheless, and she knew it. And she walked out of the building into the October evening as though she had always known it. She did not see Dominic standing at the window of his office on the 22nd floor, watching her across the street below. She did not see the expression on his face, which was not one Luca had ever seen there, and which Luca, who happened to be in the room with a logistics report, noted with the quiet attention of a man who had observed Dominic Calloway for 9 years and was watching him lose his footing for the first time. "She's going to dinner," Luca said, without particular inflection. "I know," Dominic said. "She looks," Luca said, and then paused, apparently reconsidering. "She looks," Dominic agreed quietly, as though completing the sentence from the inside. And that was the end of that conversation. The dinner was at a small Ethiopian restaurant in a neighborhood that Sebastian had not known before she recommended it, and which he had immediately and genuinely embraced. He stood outside and waited for her, and when she arrived, he looked at her, the way Marguerite had half forgotten it was possible to be looked at. They sat for 3 hours. They talked about the city's waterfront and about her mother's deteriorating hip and about a terrible film they had both loved unironically, and somewhere in the second hour she laughed at something he said. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that lived in the body. And she felt it move through her like weather, like a window opened in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. She did not tell him about the ledger. She did not tell him that she had, over the past 11 days, built a complete and documented account of an internal theft operation that had been running for 8 months, had identified the architect of it with a certainty she would stake her professional life on, and had taken a series of quiet and irreversible steps that would detonate the entire structure at a moment of her choosing. She did not tell him any of this, partly because it was not his world, and partly because she was not ready, and partly because tonight she was just a woman at dinner with a man who found her interesting, and that was enough. That was more than enough. The architect was Veronique Marsh. Marguerite had sat with this for a long time before she trusted it. Veronique was brilliant. Veronique was careful. Veronique had access to the ledger protocols because her role required it, and she had used that access with a surgical patience that would have been invisible to anyone not as intimate with the financial structure as Marguerite was. The amounts were never significant individually, 12,000 here, 8,000 there, occasionally 20. But Marguerite had tracked 23 separate transactions across 8 months, which produced a sum of $341,000 routed into a shell entity incorporated in a jurisdiction that Dominic's legal reach did not extend to without effort. The shell was registered under a name that meant nothing until Marguerite ran it through the corporate registry, cross-referenced with Veronique's biography, at which point it resolved into the maiden name of Veronique's maternal grandmother. It was a clever obscuration. It was not clever enough. The reason Veronique had mentioned Sebastian's first letter to Dominic, Marguerite understood now, was not cruelty or idle gossip. It was calculation. Veronique had noticed that Marguerite was distracted, had noticed the letter with the proprietary sharpness of someone who monitored threats, and had used it to direct Dominic's attention outward toward an irrelevant man, so that the real motion, the growing certainty in Marguerite's careful eyes, did not become the thing Dominic focused on. Veronique had bought herself time. She had not bought enough of it. The morning after the dinner, which had ended with Sebastian walking her to a cab and asking, with appropriate diffidence, whether she had enjoyed herself, and Marguerite saying yes with a simplicity that surprised them both, Marguerite arrived at the office at 7:45 and found Dominic already there. This was unusual. He was in his office without his jacket, which was more unusual, standing at his window with a coffee that appeared to be untouched, which was unusual enough to register as a kind of weather warning. She set her tote bag at her desk, poured her tea, and after 6 minutes she knocked on his office door and entered without waiting, because in 7 years she had learned that there were moods of his that required management the way weather systems required management, not control, exactly, but navigation. "You went to dinner," he said. Not a question. "I did," she said. He turned from the window. In the early light, he looked less like the controlled and elegant authority she processed daily and more like a man contending with something internal that had not resolved. He looked at her for a moment in that new way, looking at rather than looking past, and she held it steadily because she had always held things steadily. "Was it good?" he said. "The restaurant or the company," she said. He seemed unprepared for the question. She watched something shift in him. "Either," he said. "Both," she said simply, and returned to her desk. The crisis arrived at 11:47 that same morning, which is to say that it arrived on schedule, the way crises always arrive for people who have been building toward them in small, overlooked increments. Dominic received a call from an outside number that Marguerite did not recognize when it came through the main line, a number that Luca later confirmed was a burner, and the call lasted 4 minutes, and when Dominic emerged from his office, his face had done the thing it only did under genuine threat, gone very still, the way water goes still before it freezes. He looked at Marguerite, and she looked at him, and she picked up her portfolio without being asked and followed him into the conference room. Luca was already there. There was a third man Marguerite recognized as Garrett Pine, the organization's financial auditor, who was 57 years old and had the anxious, papery look of a man who had recently discovered that the ground under him was much less solid than previously advertised. He had, Marguerite gathered from the opening 30 seconds of conversation, received the same information she had been holding for 11 days, but from an external source, someone who had assembled partial evidence and was apparently planning to use it as leverage. Someone had gotten to Garrett with half the picture and sent him running to Dominic. The half picture was enough to be dangerous. The full picture, the one currently living in a password-protected folder on Marguerite's personal laptop and in a sealed envelope she had deposited with a solicitor named Dorothy Chesson 6 days ago with instructions tied to specific contingencies, was the only thing that controlled what happened next. She let them talk for 4 minutes. She listened to Garrett's panicked partial account, watched Luca's face sharpen and recalibrate, watched Dominic hold his stillness like a man holding a dam by hand. Then she said, quietly and without raising her voice, "I know who it is, and I've known for 11 days, and I need everyone in this room to listen to me carefully." The quiet that followed was the kind of quiet that has weight. She laid it out, all of it. The transaction pattern, the shell entity, the grandmother's maiden name, the cross-referenced registry, the 23 instances across 8 months, the total of $341,000, and the 3-step recovery mechanism she had already initiated through a series of completely legal financial instruments that Veronique, who was brilliant but had not anticipated that Marguerite existed in the way that Marguerite actually existed, had not anticipated. The recovery mechanism would complete within 72 hours, rerouting the $341,000 back into the organization's accounts in a way that left no trace requiring external explanation. The shell entity would simultaneously cease to be useful because Marguerite had ensured that the one transaction required to activate it beyond its current dormant state would trigger a regulatory flag. Veronique could withdraw nothing. The leverage she had built was locked. Dominic sat very still through all of this. Luca took notes. Garrett Pine made a sound at several points that was not quite speech. When she finished, the room held its silence for a moment longer, and then Dominic said, in a voice she had never heard from him before, lower than his usual register, with something raw moving underneath the control, "How long have you been building this?" 11 days for the documentation, she said. "I suspected for 3 weeks before that, and you said nothing." "I wasn't certain enough to say something," she said. "I don't say things I'm not certain of." He looked at her across the length of the conference table, and she looked back, and what passed between them in that look was not something either of them had the architecture for yet, but they both felt it, and neither looked away. The confrontation with Veronique Marsh was handled in Dominic's office at 2 in the afternoon, with Luca present and Marguerite seated at the small conference table in the corner of the room where she usually sat for operational reviews. Veronique arrived expecting a strategy meeting. That was the pretense, and understood within seconds of entering the room that she had miscalculated something fundamental. She was, to her credit, controlled about it. Her gaze moved across the room and found Marguerite, and what crossed her face was not quite guilt and not quite respect, but something in between. The particular expression of a highly intelligent person recognizing the superior intelligence they had failed to account for. The conversation was short. Dominic laid out the evidence with the precise economy of a man who had already decided the outcome and saw no reason to dramatize the process. Veronique attempted, briefly, to offer a counter-narrative and then stopped, because the counter-narrative required her to have an answer for the grandmother's maiden name and the shell entity's regulatory exposure, and she did not have one. She resigned. She left. She was escorted from the building by Luca with the controlled, effectless efficiency that Luca brought to all departures of this nature. She did not speak to Marguerite on her way out, and Marguerite did not watch her go. What happened next was not what Marguerite had expected, and she was a woman who had learned to expect precisely and to protect herself from disappointment by keeping her expectations small. Dominic did not simply return to his desk. He stood at the door of his office and looked at her, and after a moment he said, with a careful quietness that she understood cost him something, "Come have coffee with me. Not in the office. Downstairs, at the corner place. Just coffee." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, Give me 5 minutes to send a briefing note to Luca, he said. Of course. The coffee place on the corner was called Aldridge's, and it was the kind of old, unremarkable cafe that existed in the interstices of the city's expensive reinvention. Worn wooden counter, a coffee machine that sounded like minor weather, the smell of something baked earlier and not entirely gone. They sat at a table by the window and ordered without fuss, and for a moment neither spoke, and the city moved past the glass in its usual indifferent motion. He said, I have been an idiot. She wrapped both hands around her cup. She did not disagree, because she did not say things she was not certain of. He said, You have kept my entire world running for 7 years, and I have treated you like... He paused, searching for the right taxonomy of his failure. Like infrastructure. Like something that works and therefore requires no attention, she said. Yes, he said. The letter. The first one. I had Luca run a profile on the man. She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, I know. He looked startled. Of course you know, he said, half to himself. He's a structural engineer, she said. He writes letters by hand. He finds suspension bridges poetic. He is entirely unconnected to anything that should concern you professionally or otherwise. I know that now, Dominic said. She said, Why did it concern you at all? He held her gaze across the small table with the particular steadiness of a man who had decided to stop running from his own interior. Because, he said slowly, someone was looking at you in a way I had not permitted myself to look at you, and I found that I could not tolerate it. I didn't understand that yet. I'm understanding it now. She heard this. She took her time with it, turning it over the way she turned over ledger entries, looking for the authentic pattern beneath the presented surface. She found it credible. She found it, against every instinct she had cultivated over 7 years of careful self-protection, true. That is, she said, a great deal to bring to a corner cafe, he said. I've been holding it for longer than today, she said. I have a dinner planned for the 28th. He went very still. With Sebastian, she continued, and I intend to keep it. He is a good man, and he has treated me with more consistent regard in 6 weeks than I've received in 7 years in that building. What you do with what you're telling me is your own matter, but I will not rearrange my life around an awareness that arrives this late and is catalogued by your own admission under jealousy. He said, That's fair. She said, I know it is. He said, And after the 28th? She looked at him for a long time. The city shifted outside. The coffee machine produced its small interior weather. She said, Ask me something worth asking. He was quiet. Then, with the careful precision of a man learning a new language in real time, he said, I would like to know you, not as the person who manages what I cannot be bothered to manage, as you, whatever that takes, whatever pace that requires. I would like to be someone who sees you for however long you allow me to try. She did not answer immediately, because she did not answer things immediately when they mattered. She drank her coffee. She looked at the window, at the ordinary, unremarkable street, at the city she had moved through for 7 years, like a ghost who knew every corridor of the house. She thought about the letter she had written at her small desk by the window, and about Sebastian's handwriting, and about the laugh that had moved through her like a window opening, and about the fact that she was 31 years old and the world owed her nothing, and she had decided a long time ago that fine was enough, and she had been wrong. She thought about how much of herself she had compressed into the shape of invisible usefulness, and what it might feel like to stop. She said, We'll see. Which was not a door closing. It was a door remaining open with conditions, which was the only way she had ever operated and the only way she intended to. The quarterly board presentation of Callaway Industries took place on the last Thursday of October in the 44th floor's conference suite, With 11 members of the board and 4 external advisors arranged around an oval table that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. These were men and women who had built their assessments of the organization's operational hierarchy over years, and their assessments, like most institutional assessments, corresponded to the architecture of visible power, which meant that they knew Dominic Calloway, they knew his senior counsel, and they knew his operational lieutenant, and they did not, in any meaningful way, know Marguerite Bellows. They knew she existed in the way you know a switchboard exists. You don't think about it until the call fails to connect. Dominic stood at the head of the table and delivered the quarterly overview, which was, as always, precise and assured. Then he paused. He looked down the room to where Marguerite sat at the corner position she had always occupied, the position designed for assistants, angled slightly away from the primary sight lines, supplied with a smaller chair. She had her portfolio open, as always. She was watching him, as always. He said, "Before we proceed to the financial review, I want to address a structural matter. Over the past 30 days, an internal theft operation targeting our accounts was identified, documented, and neutralized. The perpetrator has been removed from the organization. The funds, $341,000, have been fully recovered. This outcome was possible because of the operational intelligence and financial architecture maintained by the person who has, in actuality, been running the true structural core of this organization for the past 7 years." He looked down the table. Marguerite Bellows identified the pattern, built the evidence chain, designed the recovery mechanism, and executed it before the rest of us were fully aware the threat existed. He paused. "I want everyone in this room to understand clearly who they are dealing with." 11 board members and 4 external advisors looked at Marguerite. She held their gaze without any particular performance of emotion, the way she held everything, with the settled, undecorated assurance of a woman who had always known her own value and had simply been waiting for the room to catch up. She said, "I've prepared a revised financial summary for the quarter with the corrected Eastern Holdings figures, if you'd like to proceed." They proceeded, and this time when she spoke, no one looked past her. There's a kind of being seen that happens all at once, like a light switched on in a dark room, sudden, total, rearranging everything. And there is another kind that happens slowly, the way dawn happens, incrementally and irreversibly, each degree of light building on the last until you cannot remember the dark. What happened between Marguerite Bellows and the world she moved through was both. The room had turned to her all at once. The man was taking longer, was earning it degree by degree, and she was allowing it at her own pace, which was the only pace she had ever trusted. She kept her dinner with Sebastian on the 28th. He brought her a book about a bridge in Portugal and talked about her mother's hip with genuine curiosity and made her laugh twice more in the good way, and she thought, sitting across from him in the easy warmth of his attention, that she did not know yet what shape her life was taking, but that it was taking a shape which was different from the flat, careful, compressed non-shape it had held for so long. She thought it was possible to be seen by more than one person in more than one way. She thought she had earned the right to find out. And in the building 6 blocks away, in an office on the 22nd floor, a man she had kept running for 7 years sat at his desk at 9 in the evening with a ledger summary she had prepared and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the most consequential person in his world had always been the one he had looked at without seeing. He was beginning to understand what it would cost him to correct this. He was, for the first time in his operational life, willing to pay it. She had learned in 7 years and 1 extraordinary month that invisibility was its own kind of armor. She had also learned, because she was the kind of woman who updated her assessments when the evidence warranted, that armor was not the same thing as living. You could take it off. You could choose who stood close enough to see the difference. You could hold that choice with both hands freely and let it mean something. She was 31 years old, and she was just beginning. And the world, this complicated, expensive, occasionally lethal, finally attentive world, was learning her name.